So we have covered till net zero. Now the next is you need to understand the geopolitics behind the climate negotiations. For that, take down the heading, write down in continuation of your last lecture, climate action related terminologies. Climate action related terminologies. First, write down climate equity. Climate equity. Write down. Climate equity is related to issues of distributive justice. Issues of distributive justice in the allocation of carbon budget of the planet. In the allocation of carbon budget of the planet. Carbon budget of the planet amongst various countries. Amongst various countries and especially between the developed and the developing countries. Especially between the developed and the developing countries. Climate equity, continue. Climate equity strives to ensure. Climate equity strives to ensure parity in per capita emissions. Parity in per capita emissions of all the countries. Of all the countries. Next, write down second, carbon budget. Carbon budget. Carbon budget of the planet is defined as total amount of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions which the humanity is allowed to make. Which the humanity is allowed to make such that the temperature rise is as per the Paris Agreement. Temperature rise is as per the Paris Agreement. In brackets, and doesn't overshoot it. And doesn't overshoot it. Brackets close. First we'll understand carbon budget and then we'll move on to climate equity. Achha, there is a target under Paris, and the target under Paris is that temperature rise must be limited to 2 degrees Celsius, but preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. In the last lecture, I told you that the planet has already heated up by 1.1 degrees Celsius, right? So the planet has already heated up by 1.1, and therefore this target, 1.5, this looks quite impossible to achieve. So what is the next best target we are aiming at? That warming should be limited to 2 degrees Celsius. If this is to happen, that by the end of the century, planet has heated up by 2 degrees Celsius, then it means that the planet's atmosphere has got greenhouse gases over and above the pre-industrial levels, and that is why there is a temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius, right? And these greenhouse gases are being emitted by humans since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so since 1750s, the greenhouse gas emissions are going on. And greenhouse gases, they can remain like carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide can remain in the atmosphere for hundreds and hundreds of years. So now this means that humanity is making the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. These greenhouse gas emissions made by the humanity in the past, made by people in the past, made by humanity in the present. That is the emissions which we are making right now and the emissions which will be made in the future. Because in the best case scenario, world is going to become net zero only in 2050. Right, and that is the best case scenario. 2050 maybe world hoga nahi net zero. So in the past there have been emissions, presently there are emissions, in the future there are going to be emissions. All these emissions are causing the warming. But we don't want the warming to breach 2 degrees Celsius. We want the warming, maximum warming to be up to 2 degrees Celsius. So all these amount of emissions which we can make such that the warming is 2 degrees Celsius but doesn't overshoot 2 degrees Celsius, doesn't cross the ceiling of 2 degrees Celsius. All these emissions are being called as the carbon budget of the planet. Another way to understand it, families have a monthly budget. What does monthly budget of the family tell us? That based upon the income levels a family has, how much of expenses a family is allowed to make in a month. Yahi hota hai monthly budget. Now what does carbon budget tell us? Carbon budget tells us that based upon the target of Paris, how much of emissions humanity is allowed to make. So these are the emissions of the past, of the present, of the future. Those many emissions which we are allowed to make, and emissions are measured in tons. So फिर ये carbon budget of the planet is going to be in billion tons, right? So around 2,500 and 3,000 billion tons is the carbon budget of the planet. So this carbon budget of the planet is actually allowing us for human development. And why do I say that? Because beta, why at all are we making the emissions? We are making the emissions for economic growth, and the economic growth is helping us to achieve our various parameters of human development. So this carbon budget of the planet becomes a resource for us. Resource is anything which has a utility. So carbon budget of the planet has a utility for us in the sense that the carbon budget of the planet is allowing us for economic growth, is helping us to achieve human development. And that's why it becomes a resource. It's a resource. But you tell me one thing, can any country claim that carbon budget comes within the sovereign jurisdiction of that country? Where are the emissions entering? They are entering into atmosphere. And the emissions, once they have entered into the atmosphere, because of wind patterns, because of air circulations, they're going to circulate all around the planet, right? ऐसा तो नहीं है that the emissions made by India are going to remain in the airspace only over India. No, that's not going to happen. The emissions which are made by various countries, they're going to circulate all across the planet. So can any country claim to have sovereign jurisdiction of the atmosphere of the planet where we are making the emissions? No, no country can claim to have that. These type of resources which are given to us by the planet, which are used by all the countries, but no country can claim to have sovereign jurisdictions over these resources. These resources are being referred to as the global commons. There is another example of global common, and that is open oceans, the high seas. You know that up to 12 nautical miles is going to be the territorial waters of our country. Then up to certain limits are going to be the exclusive economic zone of India. India has got certain rights of economic activities in exclusive economic zone. But beyond the EEZs of the countries, there are open oceans, there are high seas. High seas again are a resource because they have a role in hydrological cycle, they support marine biodiversity, they provide routes for trade, international trade, that is shipping routes. They provide space for laying down underwater internet cables. So they are being used by all the countries. But can any country claim to have exclusive jurisdictions over the high seas of the world? Is it possible? If the countries they claim to have exclusive jurisdictions, sovereign jurisdictions on the high seas, will it lead to conflicts between the countries or not? It will lead to conflicts now. What does this mean? This means that whatever is the carbon budget of the planet, which is an example of a global common, it must be distributed amongst the countries in a fair manner. It must be distributed between the countries in a just manner. Because if it is not distributed amongst the countries in a fair and a just manner, then it may so happen that powerful nations of the world, they appropriate or they consume much of the carbon budget of the planet, leaving very, very little carbon budget for the less powerful nations of the world. It can so happen now, right? But then it will lead to injustice. It will lead to some kind of unfairness in the distribution of carbon budget of the planet. So basically, we want that whatever is the carbon budget, it must be distributed in a fair manner. So the next question which comes to mind is that if the carbon budget of the planet is to be distributed, should be distributed in a fair manner, in a just manner, then what is the criteria of fairness and justice? How do we decide that based on this criteria, it will be a fair allocation of carbon budget? So then it was decided that every individual over the planet has an equal right to grow, irrespective of the country where the individual belongs to. Can belong to the continent of North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, can belong to countries of Africa, anywhere in the world, but every individual over the planet has an equal right to grow. If every individual over the planet has an equal right to grow, right? And growth calls for emissions. By growth, I mean emissions, because growth will depend upon emissions. Still today, the most dependable form of energy remains thermal across the world. So most dependable form of energy remains thermal. So if every person has an equal right to grow, every person has an equal right to make the emissions, therefore, carbon budget of the planet should be distributed amongst the countries in an equitable manner. The carbon budget should be distributed in an equitable manner. And equitable manner over here means that carbon budget should be allocated proportionate to the population of a country. Proportionate to the population of a country. So if a country accounts for 10% of the world's population, then it means that the country should be allocated 10% of the carbon budget. If the country accounts for 15% of the world's population, then the country should be given 15% of the world's carbon budget, because it is to be distributed in an equitable manner, wherein the criteria of equity is that it should be proportionate to the population of the countries. In the first decade of 2000s, abhi tak samajh aaya? Right? In the first decade of 2000s, when the COPs were happening, at that time, the developing countries, their emissions had started to rise. But at these COPs, now the first decade of 2000s was the time when the developed countries were expected to fulfill their commitments under Kyoto Protocol. They had legally binding commitments under Kyoto Protocol. So the developed countries were expected to fulfill those. On the other hand, emissions of the developing countries were rising. So a kind of tug of war between the developed and the developing countries began. In that tug of war, both had their own perspectives. The developing countries, they were expecting the developed countries to reduce their emissions because they were the historical emitters. On the other hand, the developed countries started pontificating to the developing world. Pontificating as in lecturing to the developing world. That see, climate has changed. And as climate has changed, and presently your emissions are rising at a very, very fast rate. Therefore, you must also do something to reduce your emissions. Because climate has already changed. Now the developing countries, they found it unfair. They found it unfair because they felt that for all these years, for the last 200, 250 years, the developed countries were having an unchecked growth. Because of that unchecked growth, because of that unabated growth, they were able to achieve high standards of living. They were able to achieve the exemplary standards of living. But now when it was the time for the developing countries to grow, the lecturing by the developed world was, ki boss, slow down, climate has changed. Moreover, the developing countries, they felt that this climate change did not happen because of the emissions of the developing countries. Rather, when the carbon budget of the planet is studied, most of the carbon budget of the planet had already been consumed by the developed countries in the first decade, right till the first decade of 2000s. For example, US accounts for 4% of the world's population, but US alone has consumed 25% of the world's carbon budget. North America has consumed around 30% of the world's carbon budget. European Union has consumed around 30% of the world's carbon budget. What does this mean? 30 to 35%. What does this mean? Now this means that more than 50% of the carbon budget has already been consumed by the developed countries. That is the global north. Class, do the developed countries account for more than 50% of the world's population? No. The global north doesn't have more than 50% of the world's population. But if the developed countries have consumed more than 50% of the world's carbon budget, it means that the carbon budget of the planet has been disproportionately distributed between the global south and the global north, wherein much of the carbon budget has been appropriated by the global north, leaving less than 50% of the carbon budget for the global south. But the global south, that is the developing countries, they account for more than 50% of the world's population. Now when I say developing countries, I am including China as well, because I am talking about what was happening way back in the first decade of 2000s. And in the first decade of 2000s, China was very much a developing country. So less than 50% of the carbon budget for the developing countries, more than 50% of the carbon budget used by the developed world. This is unfair, right? This disproportionate distribution of carbon budget between the developed and the developing countries is what is being called as climate inequity. So climate equity would have been when it would have been distributed in a fair manner, proportionate to the population of the country. But if it has been distributed like it has been distributed in an unfair manner, we call it as climate inequity. There is another way to know the climate inequity, and that would be through the per capita emissions. Look at the handout. First page, very first para over there, country-wise emissions. China is the biggest emitter right now. Almost 26% of annual emissions are that of China. US stands at around 12.5%. India is the third largest emitter at around 7% of global emissions. Then in absolute terms, China's emissions are around 12 billion tons, 11.5, 12 billion tons. US at around 6 billion tons, India at around 3 billion tons. So India is often clubbed with US and China because we are right now the third largest emitter. But simply saying that India is the third largest emitter, yes, we are the third largest emitter, but simply saying that India is the third largest emitter and therefore climate action of India should be same as that of US and China would be misleading, because we have to look at the per capita emissions as well. When we look at the per capita emissions, now look at the third column of the table. When we look at the per capita emissions of the countries, India's per capita emissions are 1/5 that of China, almost 1/8 that of US. We are not even comparable to the world average. World average per capita emissions are almost 3.5 times that of India's per capita emissions. So we find that there are a lot of disparities in per capita emissions as well. These disparities in per capita emissions of different countries are telling us that this is climate injustice. This is climate inequity. Because climate equity would have been that there is a parity between the per capita emissions of different countries and there is some kind of proportionate basis based on which the carbon budget of the planet has been distributed amongst the different countries. Is this discussion clear to you? Right? Now, whatever you are writing down, continue in that. Carbon budget of the planet, continue under carbon budget. Carbon budget of the planet is an example of a global common. Is an example of a global common. And therefore should be distributed. And therefore should be distributed in an equitable manner. In an equitable manner amongst the various countries. Amongst the various countries. However, much of the carbon budget has been disproportionately consumed by the developed countries of the world. Disproportionately consumed by the developed countries of the world. Developed countries of the world, which indicates climate inequity. Which indicates climate inequity. All right. So now let's go back to the first decade of 2000s. In the first decade of 2000s, the developing countries, they put up a united front at these COPs. Because these developing countries and the developing world was led by China and India. India played a very, very important role in bringing forth the concerns of the developing countries. And these developing countries had some shared interests and common concerns. Their shared interest was that all of them were growing fast and therefore they were making emissions for their economic growth and therefore using the carbon budget of the planet was their shared interest. But what was the concern? The concern was that now when they were using the carbon budget of the planet, they got to know that much of the carbon budget had been consumed by the developed world. And that was a concern. They had another concern. Another concern was that by the first decade of 2000s, the climatic impacts, the negative climatic impacts in form of the climatic disasters, they had become very common. They had become too frequent. And tropical latitudes are heavily impacted by climatic disasters. And most of the developing countries are coincidentally situated between the tropics, right? So now sea levels were rising, coastal erosion had increased, tropical cyclones, cloudburst, heat waves, forest fires, etc., etc. The developing countries, they were bearing the brunt of all these climatic disasters. And developing countries are developing because, of course, they are at low levels of development, but that means that agriculture sector is a very important sector for their economic growth, isn't it? For a country, developing country, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, all of these are going to be highly important sectors. And these sectors are very critical to the climate. Anything goes wrong with the weather, agriculture is going to be first impacted. Forest fires rage through. The forestry, the people who are into forestry, they are going to be affected, right? So now their concern was that we are bearing some losses. We are making investments into our infrastructure, but then a cyclone comes and it takes just 24 hours of the cyclone and the entire coastal infrastructure of ours collapses like a pack of cards, collapses like a house of cards. So what does this mean? That if the climatic disasters become too frequent, there is going to be reversal of the developmental gains which these developing countries were trying to make, right? Moreover, their populations being into the primary sector, their populations being into the agriculture and allied activities, so their populations were very vulnerable, were highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So now they felt that they were not responsible for this climate change, but their population was bearing the disproportionate impact of climate change because they had not caused it. Beta dekho, we are not denying the fact that the emissions of countries like India have aggravated the problem, right? But there is a difference between somebody compounding the problem and somebody creating the problem. I hope you understand that difference. Had it only been for the emissions of the developing countries, climate wouldn't have changed. So there is no denial of the fact as well that this climate change has been the making of the emissions of the developed countries. So now the developing countries, they felt that this climate change has been because of the historical emitters. But the climatic disasters are impacting the developing countries a lot. So developing countries are bearing the disproportionate damages caused by climatic disasters attributed to climate change, which is the making of the historical emitters of the world, right? Now, throughout the first decade, there was immense pressure being generated by the developed world on the developing countries to reduce their emissions. COP after COP, they were repeating, कि boss देखो, हमने माना that we are the historical emitters, but you also need to understand कि climate has changed and therefore please slow down because climate has changed. Right? You get it? कि देखो अब इसमें क्या है? आप कहो कि ठीक है यार मुझसे हो गई गलती, but अब तो हो ही गई, तो अब तू संभाल ले. तो they found it unfair कि यार तू जिसको गलती कह रहा है, that गलती is causing a huge damage and cost, that is inflicting a huge damage and cost upon my population. Right? Moreover, when you ask for climate action is always going to be a high cost endeavor. What is climate action comprising of? Mitigation and adaptation. Do you remember we discussed mitigation and adaptation? This is a high cost endeavor. It calls for funds. It takes a lot of funds. The developing countries do not have that much of fiscal space to keep diverting their funds for climate action, because the developmental priorities of the developing countries are very, very different from the developmental priorities of the developed world. Right now, what are the developmental priorities for a country like India? Still today, our developmental priority is ensuring food security. तभी तो प्रधानमंत्री गरीब कल्याण अन्न योजना चल रही है बच्चे, right? Our developmental priority is ensuring that the burden of child stunting goes down, the burden of child wasting goes down. There is tap water drinking supply, there is sanitation, school बनाओ, literacy हो, enrollment हो, उसमें midday meal scheme दो, infant mortality rate goes down, उसके लिए toilet बनाओ, लोगों को sanitation ठीक से मिले, यही सब है ना. उसके बाद jobs बनाओ. We have a lot of youth which keeps on entering the labor market every year. So यही तो है अपनी developmental priority. So now the developing countries, they felt that they don't have that much of luxury of funds to keep diverting towards climate action. But since there was a lot of pressure generated by the developed world for the developing countries, towards the end of first decade, the developing countries, they resigned to that pressure. They agreed to that pressure. They succumbed to that pressure. And the developing countries, they said, कि ठीक है, understandable that climate has changed. There is a scientific evidence which shows that climate has changed, and we being the responsible global players will go for climate action, right? So they agreed for the climate action, and then they continued, we'll go for climate action provided. तो developed ने कहा provided क्या? तो developing ने कहा provided you compensate us for the losses and the damages being caused by climate change, which our population right now is experiencing, because this climate change has been the making of the historical emissions made by you. तो developed ने पूछा compensate मतलब? तो developing ने कहा compensate मतलब पैसा दे दो. And that पैसा came to be called as climate finance. Newspaper पढ़ा था कल? पढ़ा था कुछ climate finance के बारे में? Write down. Climate finance refers to funding given by developed countries to the developing countries and least developed countries and least developed countries for their climate action. For their climate action. In brackets, that is adaptation and mitigation. That is adaptation and mitigation. Brackets close. It was finalized at 2009 COP15 Copenhagen. Spellings on board. 2009 COP15 Copenhagen. Finalized at 2009 COP15 Copenhagen. Now understand. So a deal was struck at Copenhagen. And the deal was that the developed countries, all the developed countries together, will be providing funding to the developing countries, and the developing countries are supposed to use those funds exclusively for climate adaptation or mitigation, or nothing else. And it was decided that for a duration from 2020 to 2025, total of $100 billion will be provided every year as climate finance. Total of $100 billion will be provided every year as climate finance. All the developed countries together will mobilize $100 billion, which will be divided amongst the developing countries based on the projects coming up in their countries. So there were a number of funds created for that. Number of funds, for example, adaptation fund, green environment facility, etc. These funds were were regulated by multilateral development banks like World Bank, etc. So what was how it was happening was that, let's say US, one year US says that I would like to provide $100 million as climate finance. So US approaches that fund, tells World Bank, because World Bank is the regulator, tells World Bank, I am going to provide $100 million. So now World Bank has a amount of 100 million which will be given by US. Then India approaches that fund and tells World Bank, I am coming up with a solar project. So solar project means that it is a climate mitigation thing. So I'm coming up with a solar project and I need funding for that. So now World Bank has 100 million. It looks at the project proposal of India and then provides that funding or a part of that funding to a country which is a developing country, that is India. So that is how it was happening. Now, it was expected that 100 billion will be provided, but they never provided. The developed world, they never provided the entire committed amount of 100 billion. Rather, the highest amount which has been provided in 21 and 22, that was $89 billion. And the developed countries, they say that close to 100 billion. 89 is almost 90 now, so close to 100 billion is provided. But the developing countries, they contest this figure of 89. Because the developing countries, they say that this figure of 89 is a statistical jugglery. It is misleading. They say that many a time double counting is done. Many a time what is done is that there is a debt which is provided and that is considered as climate finance. Debt should not be considered as a finance now. Finance should be in form of grants. Finance should be in form of aid, right? So the developing countries, they say that what you make high claims of, that 89 billion, you have never provided 89 billion. It is more of a statistical jugglery. It is a misleading figure of 89, which you are committing to, or which you are saying that you have provided, but actually it has been much lesser than that. Whatever. Even if, let's say, it was close to 89, then too it means that the developed countries have never been able to provide the entire committed amount of $100 billion as climate finance to the developing world. So the developed countries, they did not keep up with their commitments under Kyoto. They did not keep up with the commitments under Doha. Rather, Doha was an abject failure. And also, they have not been able to keep up with the commitments under the climate finance, under the Copenhagen Accords. Right? The next write down. Common but differentiated responsibility. Common but differentiated responsibility in brackets CBDR. CBDR. Write down. It is a principle of environmental management. It is a principle of environmental management adopted at the Rio Summit of 1992. Adopted at the Rio Summit of 1992. As per this principle, यार गाने थोड़ी चलाएंगे अब. And who keeps the ringtone like this, yaar? As per this principle, all the countries are collectively responsible for climate action. All the countries are collectively responsible for climate action. Acha. I'm repeating. CBDR is a principle of environmental management which was adopted at the Rio Summit of 1992. As per this principle, all the countries are collectively responsible for climate action, however, their climate action should be proportionate to the damage caused by a country to the planet's climate system. However, their climate action should be proportionate to damage caused by a country to planet's climate system. Understand? CBDR says that everybody has a shared responsibility, everybody has a common responsibility towards the planet's climate system, but they cannot have equal responsibility. Their responsibility should be proportionate to the climate mess created by a country. So if a country has created bigger of climate mess, the country must own up bigger share of responsibility. So class, which countries then become more responsible for climate action? Developed or developing? The developed countries, right? This is the principle of CBDR. Next, write down, next para, climate finance and CBDR. Climate finance and CBDR uphold the principle of climate equity. Uphold the principle of climate equity. So basically, both of them, CBDR and climate finance, they are based upon climate equity principle only, that there must be some proportionate basis, there must be fairness, there must be justice. Next, write down fifth one, carbon market and carbon credit. Carbon market and carbon credit. Write down. Carbon markets originated under KP, Kyoto Protocol. Carbon markets originated under KP to facilitate the developed countries. To facilitate the developed countries to achieve their targets of KP. To facilitate the developed countries to achieve their targets of KP. The unit of transaction under carbon markets is carbon credit. The unit of transaction under carbon markets is carbon credit. Look up the board and now write down that 1 carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions. 1 carbon credit is equal to 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions. Next para. Various schemes or mechanisms of carbon trading. Various schemes or mechanisms of carbon trading were available under Kyoto Protocol. Were available under Kyoto Protocol. For example, emissions trading. For example, emissions trading. Next para, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement also has provisions for carbon markets. Provisions for carbon markets. However, the carbon markets have still not been operationalized. The carbon markets have still not been operationalized under the Paris Agreement. Carbon markets have still not been operationalized under the Paris Agreement. Under the Paris Agreement. Now understand, class. Carbon market, their origin goes back to the Kyoto Protocol. Under Kyoto Protocol, it was decided that the developed countries will reduce their emissions. And then it was decided that, let's say there is some developed country which is trying hard to achieve its target of KP. However, because of something unprecedented happening, that country has not been able to achieve its target. Something unforeseen happens because of which the country is not able to achieve its target. So there must be some kind of facility, some kind of help provided to that developed country, which makes it easier for that developed country to achieve its target of KP. With this objective and intention of helping out the developed countries to achieve their targets of KP, carbon markets evolved. Class, what happens in any market? Forget carbon market. Can I say trading happens, somebody sells something, somebody buys something in markets? So now in carbon market, carbon was to be traded. But if something is to be traded, carbon in form of emissions was to be traded. But if something is to be traded, it must be quantified. So now emissions were quantified and the unit of quantification is carbon credit, wherein 1 carbon credit is equated to 1 ton of the emissions. 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions. You don't have to keep bothering about that how do we measure emissions. There are methods which have been developed by consensus amongst all the countries, scientific methods. Right? So let's say there is a thermal power plant. Based upon how much of coal is burnt in that thermal power plant, and different types of coal, different qualities of coal will make different amount of emission. A superior quality of coal versus an inferior quality of coal, we can know what amount of emissions will be made if 1 ton of coal is burnt in a thermal power plant. So there are guidelines which have been developed or methods which have been developed based on the consensus by all the countries. We don't have to keep bothering about it. All we have to know is that 1 carbon credit is equated to 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions, and now carbon credits were traded. And carbon credits were traded in various ways. There were various mechanisms available under KP for the carbon trading to happen. For example, one of the mechanisms available was emissions trading. I'll explain on the board. Keep taking down running notes. Now, emissions trading under Kyoto Protocol was allowed between 2 developed countries. It was allowed between 2 developed countries. Let's say X and Y are the 2 developed countries. So emissions trading could happen between X and Y. And X and Y, since they are developed countries, therefore both of them would have their targets under KP. So let's say for a given year, the targets were that X was supposed to reduce 10 units of emissions, Y was supposed to reduce 8 units of emissions. This was the target. What they achieved was different. What they achieved was that X reduced 8 units of emissions and Y reduced 10 units of emissions. If that is the case, can I say X has underperformed and Y has overachieved the target? Class, can I say X has underperformed and Y has overachieved the target for that year? How much of deficit does X have in achieving the target? 2 units, right? So I write it as minus 2 units. Acha, unit is carbon credit, wherein 1 carbon credit is 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions, right? How much of surplus does X have? 2 units. So I write it as plus 2 units. Now pay attention. As per emissions trading, Y can sell off this surplus 2 unit of emission reduction. This is a surplus of emission reduction. Y can sell off this surplus 2 unit of emission reduction to X. So now when accounting will be done by UNFCCC at the end of the year, book of accounts is maintained by UNFCCC. So UNFCCC will record that X for that year has reduced 10 units of emissions. Y for that year has reduced 8 units of emissions. Because Y has sold off excess 2 unit of emission reduction to X. So how would Y benefit? Why would Y sell this off? Y would benefit because X is going to pay Y for buying these emission reduction units. So Y is monetarily gaining. What is the incentive for Y to sell it? The incentive for Y is that Y gets money, right? So now you will have a question, how are prices determined? How are prices determined in a free market? Similarly, based on demand and supply of carbon credits, the prices were determined in carbon markets as well, right? So how does X benefit? X benefits because X has been able to achieve the target. Y benefits because Y is gaining money, is earning money. And for the planet, 18 unit of reduction was expected. And how much of reduction happened in that year? 18 unit, right? So it was a win-win for everybody. So these kind of facilities came to be called as carbon markets. Now we'll have these carbon markets under Paris as well. Under Paris Agreement also, there is a provision for carbon markets. However, the final terms and conditions related to the operation of carbon markets are yet not finalized amongst the countries. The countries have some points of disagreement related to the terms and conditions. Because of those disagreements, the formal markets of the Paris Agreement are yet not operational, right? So this is the geopolitics which happened in early 2000s and continued till 2020. Of late, there are new dimensions of geopolitics which are emerging. When I take up latest COPs, I discuss those new dimensions with you. Right. Now, next we'll talk about, look up the handout, page number 1. On page number 1, there are global initiatives which are given. And these global initiatives have been given by India for the global climate action. Yes, tell me. Tell me. You had a question. You had a risen hand. Louder. थोड़ा ऊंचा बोलो बेटा. अच्छा ठीक है बोलो. रिपीट करो. You'll ask me after the class? ठीक है. Anyone else has a question? UNFCCC in which context? I said UNFCCC was maintaining the book of accounts. वही खाता UNFCCC maintain करता है. So let us take up the initiatives which have been given by India for the global climate action. All these initiatives which I am going to next discuss with you are examples of India's global diplomacy. They are examples of India's global diplomacy for climate action. They are examples of India's global diplomacy for climate action. The first is International Solar Alliance, ISA. International Solar Alliance. Now, International Solar Alliance came up in 2015 at COP21 held at Paris. The founding members of ISA are India and France. The founding members of ISA are India and France. Beta, this COP, 21st COP, was held at Paris. So which was the host country? France was the host country. Host country becomes the founding member by default. So ISA has been India's brainchild. I'm telling you this to drive across the point that ISA has been India's idea. ISA was India's leadership, right? France becomes the founding member because France was the host country. So it has been India's brainchild. It has been India's idea. ISA says that all the sun-rich countries of the world, should collaborate with each other. So that globally by 2030, there is 1,000 gigawatts. There is 1,000 gigawatts, and gigawatts is 1,000 gigawatt becomes 1 terawatt. So there is 1,000 gigawatt or 1 terawatt of installed solar capacity. So it says ISA says that for climate action, augmenting solar capacity becomes essential. Enhancing solar capacity becomes essential. Instead of countries working in isolation, working separately, let the countries pool in their efforts and their resources so as to achieve the target of 1,000 gigawatts of installed solar capacity by 2030. Headquarters of ISA are also in India. It was, like I told you, it was all about India's leadership. So headquarters of ISA are also in India. In continuation of ISA, there is One Sun, One World, One Grid program or initiative. One Sun, One World, One Grid program or initiative. OSOWOC came up at the 26th COP. The 26th COP was held in 2021 at a place called as Glasgow. It was held in 2021 at a place called as Glasgow. And OSOWOC, the founding members are India and United Kingdom. Founding members are India and United Kingdom. Glasgow, the COP was hosted by UK that year. Glasgow means that the COP was hosted by UK. So again, UK becomes the founding member because it was the host country. OSOWOC again has been India's idea, right? It again has been India's idea. OSOWOC says that there must be transcontinental, interconnected power grid. OSOWOC says that there must be transcontinental interconnected power grid. Now understand what does this mean. Transcontinental means across the continents. Interconnected means integrated. So transcontinental interconnected power grid would be that South Asian countries, India has its power grid interconnected with countries like Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Then this part of South Asia has power grid interconnected with Southeast Asian countries. Then South Asia have the power grid interconnected with West Asia, and then this entire part of Asia has its power grid interconnected with Africa. Then it becomes an example of transcontinental interconnected power grid. Right? Now, what is the need of this type of power grid? Zarurat hi kya hai? Why are we envisaging transcontinental interconnected power grid? Understand the need now. Class, for any energy source to become reliable, it must have two qualities. One is that it must be affordable, it must be cost effective. And secondly, the energy source must be available always. Always in the sense it must be available 24/7, 365 days of the year. It should be available 24/7, 365 days of the year. Right. So for any energy source to become reliable, it must be available always and it should be cost effective. And when it comes to availability, thermal has a big edge over renewable. For harnessing thermal energy, for generating thermal energy, what do we need? Thermal power plants. And then India has thermal power plants. We must have the adequate supply of coal. As and when we need electricity, we burn the coal and get the energy. It doesn't happen like this for solar. India may have the solar power plants. However, as long as the sun doesn't shine, the solar power plants cannot work. Similarly, wind plants or wind farms. India can build up the infra for wind farms. But as long as the wind doesn't blow in the right direction at the right velocity, the wind farms cannot function. So any kind of renewable, be it solar, wind, tidal, all of them, they are dependent upon certain geographical factors. And therefore, they can't be harnessed 24/7, 365 days of the year. For example, any country during the night time cannot generate solar. Right? Because any country for 24/7 will not have sun-rich hours. This is an inherent limitation we have in renewable. In order to address this inherent limitation, now the countries, they envisage to have an interconnected power grid, because sun may not be shining 24/7 on a particular country, but sun 24/7 will keep on shining over the earth at different longitudes. So let's say it's night time for Southeast Asia. It has already been sunset for Southeast Asia, but it is still sun-rich hours for countries of South Asia like India. Hoga na aisa, we are to the west of Southeast Asia. So we are generating solar and we are providing that solar through interconnected power grid to countries of Southeast Asia. Then it has been sunset for South Asia, but it's still sun-rich hours for West Asia. They are generating solar, providing solar through that interconnected power grid to countries like India. Then Asia has sunset, Africa has sun-rich hours. Those countries generate solar and provide it to countries like India through the interconnected power grid. Now you may have a question कि जरूरत ही क्या है interconnected power grid की? अपना thermal है तो सही, हाँ thermal तो है ही, but point ही तो ये है ना that we must decarbonize our power sector as well. We must increase our dependence upon the renewable and the non-fossil energy sources. If we have to increase our dependence upon non-fossil, it can only happen when they are available. If they are not available, how can we become dependent on them? And for them to be available, let's have an interconnected power grid. Right? So this is going to be one of the advantages that by having an interconnected power grid, the availability becomes more reliable. I'm not saying that it will be 24/7 available, but it becomes more reliable. And the second advantage of having an interconnected power grid, the power demand keeps on fluctuating. India right now has the solar capacity of around 90 gigawatt. India right now has the solar capacity of around 90 gigawatt, but the power demand fluctuates. Depending upon the season, depending upon the time of the day. In summers, the power demand is going to be maximum. In summers, during the daytime, during the evening hours, the power demand is going to peak out. In the midnight, 12 to 3, the power demand falls down in the summer as well. So it keeps fluctuating. Let's say on a given day, we don't require the entire 90 gigawatt. Now, since winters are approaching, the power demand goes down. So India simply needs 75 gigawatts. So we have a surplus. We have a surplus of how much? We have a surplus of 15 gigawatts, right? Now, what do we do of surplus? ऐसा तो नहीं है ना कि वी हैव अ सरप्लस कैपेसिटी तो पूरी जनरेट कर लेते हैं. सर्दी का टाइम है नॉर्थ इंडिया, तो नॉर्थ इंडिया बैठा तो धूप में है, लेकिन पता है 15 गीगावाट एक्स्ट्रा है तो अंदर एसी और पंखे चला के बैठा हुआ है. इट विल नॉट हैपन ना. वी डोंट नीड इट. तो अब क्या करें? तो इफ वी डोंट नीड इट बट वी हैव अ कैपेसिटी, वी सेल ऑफ द सरप्लस एनर्जी टू अ कंट्री व्हिच एट दैट पॉइंट इन टाइम हैज डेफिसिट एनर्जी. Let's say Bangladesh says that I need 15 gigawatt. So India sells surplus of 15 gigawatt to Bangladesh. So amongst the countries, whatever mismatches are there in power demand and supply, those mismatches can be better addressed if we have interconnected power grid, right? So this is going to be the utility of OSOWOG. Online, there is a question. The question was, did India receive any climate finance? Yes, we have been amongst the biggest recipients of climate finance. Another question was that sometimes what happens is that the carbon credits are also the emissions offset. Beta, there are many informal carbon markets which are operating. In India also there are informal carbon markets which are operating through which companies can earn carbon credits. So let's say there is a company which goes for huge afforestation. Forest is going to act as a carbon sink, and let's say that forest is now absorbing 10 units of emissions. So if it is absorbing 10 units of emissions, these 10 units of emission which have been absorbed by this carbon sink of a forest will be called as the carbon credits earned by that company. Right? So nowadays, the government is pushing the private sector that you must go green with time. Go green in the sense that you must decarbonize with time. So there is a lot of pressure by the governments across the world on their private sector. So the companies of the private sector, since they want to create an impression with the government that they are responsible, they are acting in a responsible manner. That's why the companies often undertake these kind of carbon sequestration projects. Through these carbon sequestration projects, the companies do earn carbon credit. How do they earn carbon credit now? Government provides them certificates. पैसा नहीं देती है सरकार अभी, but government provides them certificates of carbon credits. It's like a commendable work which you have done, and that's why you're being certified by the government, right? So that is how it happens. Climate finance, is it provided as per the population? No, climate finance is not provided based on the population. Climate finance is provided based on the projects which the country is coming up with. If the country is able to convince the developed world that I have a project which is for climate mitigation and adaptation, then the country gets the climate finance. Abhay online, kitne questions hote hain na beta? Abhay beta, yes. Now he says, ma'am, can carbon markets operate in private market as well? Yes, right now carbon markets are operating in private sector as well. मैंने क्या बोला? मैंने बोला a company has set up a forest, has gone for afforestation. That forest is acting as a carbon sink. तो वो company को it is earning carbon credit. So there are privately carbon markets. Privately in the sense that they are not under the Paris Agreement, but there are carbon markets running in many countries. China has carbon markets. US, India also has carbon markets now. But they are being run privately. They are not being regulated under the Paris Agreement. Of course. Her question is, ma'am, also WOG, interconnected power grid. We can only have an interconnected power grid amongst the partners, amongst the countries which share good relations with each other. India would never want to have an interconnected power grid with China and Pakistan. Power grid थोड़ी terrorize कर देनी है. This is a limitation. हाँ, it can't be one whole world. बेटा जब कहते हैं ना one sun, one world, one grid, तो उसका मतलब one whole world कभी नहीं होता है. Right? वो practically possible नहीं है. तो उसका मतलब होता है कि रीजनल स्केल पर आप करो, या फिर what I explained. Right now, India has already entered into agreements with West Asia and Southeast Asia to have interconnected power grid. And if with time Asia is able to convince Africa, when I say Asia, I don't mean China convincing Africa. I mean this part of Asia, ये West Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, convinces Africa to have an interconnected power grid, that will solve much of the purpose for at least India. Right? Africa has a huge potential for solar. So that will solve it. So when we say one world, it doesn't mean whole world. It means the countries which of course share friendly relations with each other, which are reliable bilateral partners with each other. Right? There is another disadvantage. If you have a trust deficit with a country, right now in the 21st century, there are unconventional modes of warfare which are being used by the countries. Unconventional modes of warfare would be that grids are terrorized as well, or grids are used for raging a warfare on another country as well. So we don't want all that to happen. We of course, इसका एक disadvantage मैं आपको बता देती हूँ. When you have an interconnected power grid and some part of the grid collapses, entire grid collapses because your grid is interconnected. Right? So if there is a failure, there is a breakdown in some part, तो पूरा का पूरा grid जो है वो collapse हुआ. So that is a disadvantage. Anyone else has a question? कैसे करना है स्टोर? कैसे करोगे? अच्छा, now the question is कि मैम ये तो नहीं पता कि कैसे करेंगे स्टोर, बट कर तो सकते हैं, कर सकते हैं. एसी बनता है पावर ग्रिड में, उसको डीसी में कन्वर्ट करते हैं, डीसी में उसको बैटरी में स्टोर करते हैं, उसके बाद जब चाहिए होता है वो डीसी को दोबारा एसी में कन्वर्ट करते हैं. बहुत पैसा लगता है और बहुत लॉसेस होते हैं. एसी से डीसी, डीसी से एसी. उससे बेटर है बेच के पैसा कमाओ और उस पैसे से और कुछ करो. ठीक है? और कुछ से मेरा मतलब वेस्टफुल सब्सिडी नहीं है. एक यूथफुल कंट्री के लिए उसको जहां चैनलाइज करना चाहिए. यूथफुल कंट्री, हम वी आर द यंगेस्ट कंट्री ऑफ द वर्ल्ड. एक यंगेस्ट कंट्री ऑफ द वर्ल्ड जिस तरह का एक्सपेंडिचर कर रही है इन फॉर्म ऑफ सब्सिडीज, उस वेस्टफुल सब्सिडीज, नॉट द मीनिंगफुल सब्सिडीज. ऑलराइट, ये हुआ बच्चे. Anyone else has a question? So it can be done. It is technologically feasible, but financially it's not viable. $500 gigawatts by 2030? What is our installed power capacity as of today? हाँ? अरे ये सोलर है, ये एंटायर नॉन फॉसिल नहीं है, ये सिर्फ सोलर है. अभी इंडिया का पावर ब्रेकअप पढ़ाऊंगी मैं, एनर्जी ब्रेकअप. ठीक है? हमारे नॉन फॉसिल का एक पार्ट है बेटा सोलर. आवर नॉन फॉसिल प्रेजेंटली इज 44% ऑफ आवर टोटल एनर्जी मिक्स. आवर टोटल एनर्जी कैपेसिटी राइट नाउ इज 434 गीगावाट. उसका ऑलमोस्ट 44%, मतलब ऑलमोस्ट 45% हमारा नॉन फॉसिल है. उसमें से एक कंपोनेंट हमारा सोलर है. ठीक है? फिर मैम कैसे करेंगे 500 गीगावाट बाय 2030? कर लेंगे यार, देखी जाएगी. ऑल राइट, द नेक्स्ट मिशन लाइफ. Mission Life, wherein life stands for lifestyle for environment. नहीं अभय, ऑनलाइन हैंड रेस कर करके पूछता है ऑनलाइन बैठा हुआ. नो बेटा, CDM is not operational right now. Mission Life, lifestyle for environment. This again was given by India at the 26th COP held in 2021 at Glasgow. Now, based upon the lifestyles, emissions are of two types. Emissions of necessity and emissions of luxury. Emissions of necessity and emissions of luxury, right? Based upon the lifestyles. The rich nations of the world are indulgent into more of emissions of luxury, whereas the poorer nations of the world are more indulgent into emissions of necessity. I'll give you an example of what is meant by emission of luxury or emission of necessity. When India today is the third largest emitter, the emissions which India is making are for achieving various sustainable development goals. Eradicating poverty from the country, ensuring a decent standard of living for the population, ensuring jobs, food security, etc., etc. The list goes on. All of these are SDGs. So basically, the emissions being made by India are more of emissions of necessity. In contrast, for a rich country like US, since they have been able to attain all these basic minimum needs for a very long time, their standard of living, their lifestyles today are very different as compared to the countries like India. US has a high dependence for transport. US has a high dependence upon private vehicles. And of late, the private vehicles, electric private vehicles are available over there. But for a very long time, it has been dependence upon petrol-based cars, right? Electric cars are still not that much popular because they are costly in US as well. Now, US is a country which has all the resources available for ensuring clean public transport comes up in the country. Example of clean public transport, electric buses. Example of clean public transport, Delhi Metro. So US has all the resources to ensure that clean public transport happens. But US does not have clean public transport because the automobile lobby in US has been very, very strong. Therefore, there has been heavy dependence upon fossil fuel-based private cars in US. Class, you tell me, which of the two has a lesser carbon footprint? Clean public transport or private cars? Of course, clean public transport. So now when US transport sector makes huge emissions, that becomes an example of emission of luxury because it's a behavioral thing. It is associated with the lifestyle choices which the US people are trying to have, right? Another example, California is the richest state of US. In California, they do not have a system of or a culture of switching off lighting in any time of the day in public buildings. So office, malls, they may be shut down at night time, but the lighting systems, the lights will always be on 24/7. The lighting is on in a state like California. It's a behavioral thing again, right? Another example, US schools in California, they open at around 8 in the morning usually. They switch on the air conditioning systems I'm talking about government schools. They switch on the air conditioning systems at 7 in the morning such that by the time the students arrive at 8 to the school, the classroom temperatures are comfortable to sit in, right? अब बेटा comparing it with the government school of India, हमारे government school में पंखा हो और चल जाए, वो बड़ी बात है. So the rich countries of the world are often guilty of making many emissions which are related to their high standard of living, which are interpreted by the developing countries as emissions of luxury. And within any country, take India now, the richer sections of the population, the affluent sections of India's population, again are guilty of making emissions of luxury, wasteful emissions, because the rich will always be making consumption which is wasteful, which we today think has become a necessity, but actually probably earlier generations were doing without all that and they were having a good lifestyle. Think of our grandparents. Our grandparents did not have so much of consumer items in their lifetimes as we get exposed to, isn't it? So did our grandparents, they had a decent life na? वो भी तो मजे में रहे थे, imparted good values to us, to the younger generations as well, right? तो बच्चे, I am not saying कि अब you can come with कि ma'am back then India was having very, very low levels of life expectancy. अरे यार, improving life expectancy then becomes an emission of necessity. All I am saying is that the present generation actually is making a lot of consumption which is not needed. We just need to be more thoughtful and conscious about it. For example, the entire fashion industry, the textile industry, the apparel, the synthetics. You go to any mall, I am amazed what has happened to the textile and the apparel industry. Why are natural fabrics like cotton, not popular nowadays. Cotton, linen, आप market में जाओ, वो available होंगे at very high cost. Otherwise, बेटा, आप Western nations के malls में चले जाओ, you will always find synthetics. Synthetics, you use them, then you throw them. They take a very, very heavy toll on the environment, and they're not even good for the health. They're not even good for the health. Allow your skin to breathe. Wear a cotton. This is an example. मैं क्यों बता रही हूँ ये इस तरह से? Because बच्चे, this is an example which helps us to rethink, to introspect that what are the ways in which we can be more mindful of the lifestyle choices which we are making. You get it? Of the lifestyle choices which we are making. Mission Life is all about that when it comes to planet's environment, when it comes to planet's climate system, everybody is a stakeholder. 8 billion people. Not just the governments are the stakeholder. Everybody is a stakeholder. 8 billion of us on the planet become the stakeholder. And let each one of us be more mindful of our lifestyle choices in our own individual ways. Whatever we can reduce in our consumption so that it's going to be environmentally friendly, let's do that. Let's say I decide I will minimize my plastic footprint. Wherever possible, I will not use plastic. Because I can, and at the end of the day, I can simply say, यार एक ही तो straw use किया था. But we are 8 billion. One straw by me will make it 8 billion straws for the planet. Right? So wherever possible, I reduce, and each one of us reduce our plastic footprint and other unnecessarily consumptions which are made by humans. So Mission Life says that every individual should have environmentally friendly lifestyle. Environment friendly lifestyle. That is Mission Life. Let's have environmental friendly lifestyles. That is Mission Life. There is a reason why India propagated it. What I conveniently called as emission of necessity and emission of luxury. Once somebody has attained a certain standard of living, then what is being construed as luxury by somebody else may be a necessity for the rich. आप समझे वाली बात? The poor may think of it as a luxury, but for rich, it becomes a necessity. Because it's got to do with behavioral choices. And behavior is very difficult to change. The best way to change behavior is to bring about self-motivation in that individual to change the behavior. Otherwise, enforcing behavioral changes from outside is going to be very difficult. So for a developing country like India, convincing the developed world or convincing the countries like US that they are making emissions which are wasteful, which are emissions of luxury, it is a difficult thing to do. Therefore, India came up with this idea of Mission Lifestyle, which says that let's bring about changes on our own. The governments, of course, cannot enforce upon their people. So everybody has to be more conscious, more aware, sensitive to how the planet is getting affected because of our activities on the planet. Right? The next is Global Biofuel Alliance, fourth wala. I'll discuss Global Biofuel Alliance in some time. When I take up ethanol blending, at that time I'll take up Global Biofuel Alliance. Now let us discuss the last three COPs.